Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our fourth webinar in this series. Today, we'll be talking about accelerating your business to the new normal, understanding agility in your risk management strategies. If you'd like to watch some of our previous webinars, the recordings can be found on the Poirier Group website. We're currently in an interesting climate where we're emerging out of the recent pandemic and we'll be facing a new normal where businesses are facing an increased amount of risks and challenges. Today, we'll be sharing how companies need to dynamically measure their risk while delivering their organizational recovery. As a bit of an introduction to the Poirier Group, we're a Toronto-based boutique management consulting firm founded in 2005. We're focused on strategy execution with a specialty in process improvement, strategy development, cost optimization, and operational efficiency. We partner with clients across a diverse range of industries and provide them with customizable, sustainable solutions that transform and improve their business. Today, we're joined by some great speakers. David Poirier is the founder and CEO of the Poirier Group. He is a dynamic and visionary leader who brings considerable experience from senior executive roles in the retail, general merchandise, food distribution, health, and life sciences industry sectors. He creates and executes operational strategies, business transformation, and process improvements that positively impact organization. He thrives at running multiple global divisions in complex and ever-changing business environments and affecting positive cultural shifts that impact the bottom line performance. Rob Brickman is a collaborative problem solver and trusted advisor who makes organizations more effective, compliant, adaptive, and profitable in managing their reliance on third parties. Rob's passion is making sure that there is structure, good governance, and financial benefit whenever an organization entrusts processes, services, and infrastructure to a third party. Rob brings over 30 years of experience in consulting experience in outsourcing, governance, operational risk management, finance, business and IT strategy, and large program management. Finally, Vaughn MacLellan is a Toronto-based partner with DLA Piper, a global business law firm. He practices corporate and securities law with an emphasis on corporate finance, mergers and acquisitions, and securities compliance matters. He acts for a variety of clients, including public and private companies, investment dealers, venture capital funds, and private equity sponsors. He also advises clients on an array of general securities and corporate law matters, including public company securities law compliance and corporate governance issues. Vaughn is currently the chair of the Association for Corporate Growth, Toronto chapter. Before we begin, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank the Association for Corporate Growth for being our promotional partner. We would also like to acknowledge the Financial Executives International Canada and the Institute for Industrial and Systems Engineering for their support. We have hosted previous webinars with IASE and ACG, the recordings of which are available on our website and may provide additional context for what we'll be talking about today. Some general housekeeping before we get started. This webinar will be recorded and a copy of it will sent to you by email. There's a PDF version of this webinar available in the handout section at the bottom right drop-down menu. You can download it before the live webinar is over, or you can contact me after the webinar and I can send it to you directly. We welcome questions throughout the session. Please type them into the chat window and we will answer them as time permits. Any other questions or comments can be sent to us after the webinar as well. I will now pass things off to David, who will kick us off.
Thank you, Maggie. I appreciate that, and welcome everybody to another one of our webinars related to the current times that we're in and how we're going to manage through these and into a successful future. We have a number of different things that we want to talk about today, where we come from, where we're going, what is Agile Risk Management, and how do we go about implementing it within organizations, and then talking about operationalizing it, and then navigating transactional activities as well and the risks from a different perspective that Vaughn's going to provide us with. And then we'll open up to those questions and answers at the very end of this. And we're certainly glad to follow up on any other questions you may have by contacting us through our website. So now let me first start off on the next slide with setting the scene. So disruptions aren't new to us. The magnitude and the depth and breadth of the disruption that we have right now is certainly unprecedented. And the key to moving forward around this is really innovation, awareness, and speed of change. And we've seen more innovation in the last few months than we've seen in a very long time. Organizations have been forced to be innovative in order to survive. As we continue through this and work through our recovery curves and growth curves, innovation is going to continue to be very critical in a hyper-competitive marketplace. We'll have competitors who are strong, some that are weak, and some that are desperate. And the desperate ones tend to disrupt industries with their behaviors. And so that's going to create some more risks for organizations. The faster we go, the more innovative we are, the more risks we're taking within an organization. And so risk management becomes really critical. And so managing that increased amount of risk is going to require different skills, different functions, and in some cases, different structures than it has previously. And so it's really about being agile and managing those risks at the new speed of business. And that means moving quickly and easily and creating clarity of communication, measurement, and governance for organizations. The last thing I want to touch on is, for the last 20 or 30 years, organizations have been driving efficiency through their businesses, whether it's the offices, the supply chains, the manufacturing centers. Every one of those areas has been focused on reducing costs, increasing efficiency, which has resulted in organizations being more rigid than they ever have been before, less room for hiccups along the way. And what we're going to see now is far more focus put on optionality versus optimality, providing alternatives in supply chains and methods of doing things, backup systems within organizations that will enable organizations to carry on when they face future disruptions. On to the next slide. Great, thanks. So we've touched on these four words in previous webinars: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And those of you in the audience that are responsible for risk management probably shudder at those four words. The VUCA really came out of the US Army in studying situations, and we have all of those conditions right now. And so as a result of that, we really require multiple scenarios in planning the organization. Each one of those scenarios has inherent risks associated with it and requirements for execution. The fundamentals that we've always followed in developing plans and executing remain the same: observe, orient, decide, and act. But the way that we have to do that and the speed with which we have to do that is changing dramatically in the coming months. And so now what I'd like to do is introduce to you Rob Brickman, a senior consultant with the Poirier Group, to talk about Agile Risk Management.
Great, thanks, David. So if there's one thing that our recent experience has shown, and David sort of pointed this out, is that we're facing real challenges in how we deal at an enterprise level with risks that come up on us quickly or have really pervasive impacts. So think of that as onset and impact. And in the next few minutes, what I'd like to do is take you through really the traditional risk models that we've been using and how they may have fared in adapting to this pandemic threat, how we can shift to a more adaptive view. And I want to review a couple of the new models that are coming out and new tools that are coming out to manage risk in a more agile and adaptive fashion. So first, what do we mean by agile risk management? Well, what we mean is that your organization will be able to quickly adapt to threats that are on the horizon and threats that are impending. And that may affect your risk profile, your risk appetite, maybe the responses to the risk. And some of the outcomes are that by anticipating the onset and impact of risks, especially high velocity risks, you're able to better formulate the solutions that have to be in place. You want to ensure, unlike a lot of companies that experienced this through the pandemic, that you're ensuring that you're profitable, that you're liquid, even during a time of disruption, and that you're coping in an environment where you may not understand the risk and you may not have controls in the organization to manage them. So that's where we're headed. Now, as you can imagine, this is going to require some disruptive thinking. As David has pointed out, this is the triumph of options and agility over optimality and precision. And we're going to showcase that in some of the findings that we have later on. Being able to manage disruptively, bringing agile techniques to your leadership and to your management of risk. And also not being afraid to fail, but if you do, fail early and learn fast. The ability to use continuous real-time risk intelligence to inform your planning, and then obviously to embrace change that's supported by technology. So let me take you to how traditionally we've managed enterprise risk. Most of you have seen or worked with these models, whether it's COSA or 3 lines of defense or the PESTEL classification system, or maybe you work in cybersecurity with NIST protocols or in IT and other domains. What's common about all of them is that they're complex, they're challenging, they're hard to implement, they are expensive to support, and they really don't scale to smaller organizations. Fortune 500 companies typically use these models. Smaller organizations use them on an as-needed basis and try and scale them back so that they're feasible. And finally, the reporting that comes out of systems like this and models like this is typically compliance-focused, and it's not really timely. So they were never intended to deal with the kind of high-velocity change that we've been seeing. And there's another paradox that comes into play, which is that with these models, because they are so complex, the better you become at managing the known risk profiles that you have, the harder it might be for you to spot changes and to respond to new threats and to see weaknesses. So let's take a look at how we've traditionally prioritized risk. So on the left, you've all seen 3x3 risk maps, heat maps like the one there. And what you're really doing here is mapping out strategies and plans based on the impact and likelihood or probability of an impact, right? And typically, as leaders, we want to take actions that have a meaningful impact on these risks. We want to figure out what resources we're going to have to invest. And sometimes we decide that maybe risk acceptance or watching rather than doing is a feasible option. And that's okay, so long as it's not risk avoidance. What's interesting to me, though, is Gardner's take on this. And Gardner did a study on executive behavior on risk and how they size up the actions that are required. And executives typically want a lot of certainty about the impact of emerging risks. They're going to ask questions about whether those are future-proof. Are we doing enough? And Gardner sizes this up as a trade-off between the level of precision you have and the size or scale of the action that you want to take. Well, if there's one thing we've learned over the last 4 months, it's that there was no precision about COVID-19 impacts. And precision is really not consistent with being agile. And that's a challenge. So that's one of the reasons that David has pointed out, the whole priority of optionality, keeping your options open, rather than focusing on precision. Okay. Shifting to a more agile model for risk also means asking different questions. So the questions we should be asking are we doing the right thing? Are we doing it fast enough? And since we may not get it right the first time, are we open to the experience of failing, as long as we put a fence around it? And can we learn from any failures that occur? So we're going to now take a look at some of the ways that traditional risk management may have failed to keep up with the velocity of change. And the chart in front of you really just lays out in 4 quadrants some of the different risks. I'm not going to take you through each of them. I thought what I would do is showcase a few examples of organizations that have either thrived or barely survived And we're going to jump across these risk categories as we do that. So all of us are pretty familiar with the success stories that have been in the news, the Zooms, the Amazons, the Uber Eats. As David has pointed out, the agility of some manufacturers to shift. So you've got sail makers who are now making gowns and producing masks. And companies like Loblaw, for example, that has really shown a lot of innovation and social responsibility. And we've also experienced what happened to the airline industry, travel industry, and so on, because, and obviously meat processors who've demonstrated really poor controls during the pandemic. So let's focus on some wins. Campbell's, the soup company. Before the pandemic, Campbell's did almost half its business in the industrial and commercial space. They supplied restaurants and hotels with giant amounts of soup and other products. They sensed what was going on. They turned on a dime and they scaled back those industrial-sized offerings and packaging, and they shifted to the offerings that consumers really wanted. Consumers were sitting and working from home. They were in isolation, and Campbell's came back with smaller, family-sized packages of high-demand comfort foods. Here's a not-so-good example that hits supply chain and risk around diversification. So there's a global sportswear company. When the pandemic hit, it had 5 cargo ships that were forced, full of product, forced to be anchored in San Diego Harbor. All of their global suppliers shut down. Production in 7 of their global locations shut down. Their product was seasonal, which means that all of the product on those 5 container ships may not be sold once it's delivered. And of course, they have nowhere to sell it because their bricks and mortar retail channels are closed. The lesson learned is this company's risk strategy involved a whole lot of global diversity. They thought that if they could have production in a number of different countries and source products in different countries, they were safe because no combination of those countries could close. And what they learned was globalization is not a safe harbor when there's a pandemic. The example I really want to share with you today, and this is a real success story, is one that's close to home. And it touches on operational risk and strategy and service excellence and locus of control issues, and that's Baycrest Hospital. Baycrest here in Toronto is a world-class geriatric brain health research center and care center. They also happen to have some of the most fragile and high-risk patients in Canada and residents. So for them, risk management and agility during the pandemic was life and death, literally life and death. And over 4 months, they have constantly shifted because of daily government instructions on care protocols and physical security and safety. They took hundreds and hundreds of their staff and reassigned them to front-facing, patient-facing roles at very significant personal risk. Their patients were almost completely isolated, so Baycrest deployed dozens and dozens of iPads equipped with Zoom and FaceTime because some of the patients hadn't seen or spoken with their families in months. The result? For Baycrest, they've had just a handful of positive cases of COVID among staff and patients, and that's a real success story. But here's the other side of it, and this is something to bear in mind, which is it's not a limited success. Baycrest also has an entire staff team that's experiencing enormous stress. Some of them believe they have PTSD. They are completely exhausted. No one in the organization had a vacation for 4 months, and that policy is set to continue. And staff who had some pre-existing medical conditions were even asked to go on the front line. And so you can see that a lot of waves of risk are about to come, including the workforce risks here. The bottom line is that companies that adapted to new risks in an agile way were really able to thrive and survive. So let's take a look at an emerging model. This one embeds a selection of tools that can be used to complement traditional risk. And what I'll do here is use an example. So first of all, on the left, you will see, and this is from Arthur D. Little, which has done some great work on adaptive risk. So this is not a timeline or a transition plan. What this is a toolkit of approaches that you can use under different risk scenarios with the right degree of agility and adaptation. So on the right, what we've done is to summarize perhaps 3 degrees, 3 different kinds of scenarios with increasing levels of need and of change. The simple message is that the less well you understand the risks, or the less well you've been able to control those risks, the greater degree of agility you're going to need. And you need to bring different tools and different risk management to the fore. So for example, if you've got increasing risks, risk velocity, that is, you feel that this is going to be pretty pervasive, it's going to affect your organization very quickly, maybe you start looking forward-facing. You use horizon scanning. You bring risk specialists in to take a look at what's coming next. Maybe you use AI, so artificial intelligence, and maybe what that generates is a view to the horizon, which says there are some little risks on the horizon which by themselves aren't worth worrying about, but in aggregate, they're going to form a greater risk. And then you are forging a response based on that better intelligence. And then finally, in the case of a really severe high velocity risk like a pandemic, where everything is poorly understood, there are no controls in place, that calls for a great deal more executive ownership, proactive management, and the ability to really use lean methods, learn fast, fail early, use sprints, create cross-pollination so that you're setting up adaptive leadership across the organization. And then once all of that is understood, once the risk is better contained, once your controls are in place and your risk indicators are there, then you start to restore oversight to the risk function. So this kind of model is really innovative because it's adaptive to the kind of onset, the kind of risk velocity, and your understanding of the risk as you go forward. Now let me share with you a concept for a risk operations center, which is really the start of how you operationalize this. And this is really a closed loop model to anticipate and respond to threats based on some real-time risk intelligence, some analytics, and a team that's positioned to work with the executives, business units, and others. And it's important that it's closed loop because the findings and the status of those sprints comes back into play. And the example I would use here is, imagine for a moment that you are a fashion retailer. You've implemented this risk operations center, and you start to sense that something is changing significantly in your customer preferences. You go onto social media, and maybe there's a pervasive rumor that all of the dyed fabrics in your product lines are toxic in some way. You have no idea whether it's a hoax. You have no idea if it's real. You may not know whether it's sabotage. And so your objective is really to use the Risk Operations Center to identify if there's going to be attrition to the customer spend, how it's going to take place, and what actions you should take, and whether it exceeds your risk tolerance. So the first part of that would be to take a look at trusted, clean, shareable, continuous, real-time risk intelligence. There are any number of tools. You could be using your ERP systems, your CRM systems. Maybe you're using Shopify Analytics or Google Consumer Insights, or maybe you're going to Hootsuite to take a look at what social media is saying. What are you looking for? Well, you may be looking for the root cause of the problem. How are your customers reacting to it? Are there replacement options that you should consider? How are your competitors dealing with it, and so on? So that risk intelligence starts to flow. You throw that into workflow and analytics tools, maybe Tableau, so that you get a bit of a visualization and an analytics. There are other ones as well, and some workflow that drives options to your response center. For organizations that don't have the resources for these kinds of tools, I've seen it done with Excel, and I've seen it done with some collaboration tools that are less robust. The tool doesn't really matter as much as the process. The response center then takes a look at all of this input on an ongoing basis, day by day, starts to orchestrate actions in the form of a sprint or multiple sprints to the lines of business, maybe to external partners, or maybe a CRO, because we look back at the Arthur D. Little model. If it's really pervasive, then you want executive sponsorship for some of this. Those sprints get acted upon, and the outcomes, because it's a closed loop, as those sprints proceed, you've got feedback on the lessons learned. And you can continue to supplement that with a risk intelligence that keeps flowing. So the bottom line here is that you've got very adaptive risk monitoring, risk planning, and a feedback loop that allows you to take further action as needed. So how should we operationalize this? Well, let's start with what David outlined in the introduction, which was dynamic scenario planning based on your best available options. The way I would frame it is, do you have a view to the horizon? Start to set up a risk governance model like the Risk Operations Center. And if your organization is of a specific size that can support it, create a CRO function. If you don't have that, then it's probably worth assigning a greater risk responsibility to a CFO or other C-level executive, just in case we have a pervasive kind of risk. You want to start to identify sources of relevant real-time risk intelligence. That may vary by sector, that may vary by the business you're in, it may vary by who your customers are, where you do business. You want to look into analytics and how to visualize these risks, and then you want to start the transition towards more agile models. One thing that is coming through loud and clear is that a lot of the data that flows in is qualitative. It's highlighting qualitative issues. Those need to be converted into quantified risks so that you can budget for them and create your sprints. And one model that's emerged that's really interesting, I encourage you to go to the site, is the FAIR Institute model, which really it comes out of the IT world, but it's used more and more for enterprise risk to quantify those risks. Key, again, is to socialize this through the organization and find pockets of support for agile management through the organization. And then align your business functions. And the message there is we adapt and therefore we thrive. So I hope that's been helpful. And what I'd like to do now is hand off to Vaughn, who will talk a little bit about the new normal, the here and now, and some implications for the mergers and acquisition space.
Well, thank you very much, Rob. And following on from what David and Rob have talked about in terms of agility and risk management and operationalizing agile risk management, I'm going to speak about navigating transactional activity in the COVID era, and more broadly about certain considerations in dealing with COVID from a legal perspective. One thing I do want to stress is obviously, look, business and commercial needs need to drive legal and not the other way around. But in thinking about how to deal with risks, how to operationalize adaptation to risk, and in changes to your organization, there are obviously a number of legal touch points that come into play. I want to start by going back to a few of the points that David made at the outset, as they're important in framing this discussion. It goes without saying that COVID has been unprecedented. We haven't had anything close to it in our lifetimes in terms of the breadth and depth of its impact. It's impacted the entire economic ecosystem. So the demand side, the supply side, and the regulatory environment. It's impacted everyone across multiple relationships, customers, suppliers, employees, lenders, shareholders, landlords, and government. And of course, it's been global in nature. So the speed, severity, and scope of this is going to result in an ongoing period of adaptation with long-lasting implications. We will be dealing with this through 2021 and likely beyond. There's no crystal ball, and tremendous uncertainty is going to be with us for some time. So it has been a massive disruption, and it will continue to be a massive disruption. But as David's noted, disruptions are not new. And while they're not on this scale, we deal with disruptions all the time. We deal with risk and uncertainty all the time, and we have a variety of ways to do so. So I want to look at dealing with this from mostly an operational perspective in getting into some of the legal considerations, and really with two scenarios in mind: dealing with the here and now and the impact on your existing business, and dealing with the future and thinking about growth largely from an M&A perspective. So perhaps if we could have the next slide. So, looking at these two scenarios is a reflection of what occurs with this disruption, because disruption increases risk dealing with the crisis and the emergence of the new normal with a focus on survival and stability. But disruption also equals new and increased opportunities. So whether it's in the way that you're adapting to the crisis and whether that can transform your existing business for stability and organic growth, or opportunities that arise for transformative M&A. In either scenario, the key to moving forward is awareness, agility, and innovation that Rob and David have talked about. And moreover, in each case, there are choices and considerations that arise between the short term and the long term, and focusing on strategy and tactics. And these will often be competing and conflicting. So in the short term, for instance, there's a necessary focus on immediate health and stability away from longer term goals. And for strategic players, for instance, this can mean a focus on the existing business and avoiding M&A. While in the private equity realm, this can mean a focus on existing portfolio investments versus new deal activity. So in the near term and long term, the focus will shift, but things need to be done differently. This is also impacted, of course, by industry. So certain industries have obviously been disproportionately affected by COVID. Travel, leisure, non-essential retail as examples. This, together with the mere breadth and depth of the crisis, creates not only a triage situation for businesses for the time being, but it sets up a new environment for M&A as well, which is focused on rescue deals, restructurings, and distressed sales. At the same time, other sectors have flourished during the crisis, positioning them in a very different manner for the future, but not without risk as to how things evolve from here. In terms of the here and now, with your existing business, this is really about preservation and adaptation. Your focus is on priorities and actions for your business centered around surviving the crisis and stabilizing operations. And so there are various parts to this that touch on the various stakeholders and elements that I talked about before: employees, customers, supply chains, and liquidity. For employees, with businesses to stabilize operations, it's critical that they prioritize and protect the health of their employees. Protecting physical health is a necessity, but so is dealing with mental health and stress. So this means adapting work environments from factory floors to corner offices to deal with guidelines and measures for COVID for physical distancing, for instance, both with increased remote work arrangements and adaptation for an eventual return to the physical environment for working in the COVID era. So this will be an ongoing process. You'll have operational and legal implications for businesses, ranging from compliance with government regulations around what work in the physical environment looks like going forward, to employer duties to accommodate, to real estate requirements, to technology use and issues that can come with it around data protection and privacy, and working through a variety of regulatory, policy, and contractual matters that come up with all of these. In the customer realm, on the demand side, for businesses to stabilize, you need to focus on your customers and understand their liquidity and their demand. Adapting existing arrangements with customers may be required, particularly where they're in default of obligations to your business, or of course, if you're in default of your obligations to your customers. And this will also involve working through a variety of regulatory, policy, and contractual matters. Similarly, stability obviously requires a focus on the supply chain and the liquidity and operational capabilities of suppliers. So again, adapting existing arrangements with suppliers may be required. There may be defaults to address in contracts, and perhaps new impacts and restrictions that will have arisen due to COVID. This will also involve working through a variety of regulatory, policy, and contractual matters. Finally, businesses need to continue to assess and ensure liquidity and capitalization. This means working with a variety of parties, including lenders, shareholders, landlords where applicable, and government, potentially, given the significant assistance which is being provided to industry. With lenders in particular, businesses need to ensure continued access to credit facilities or work to find other solutions, whether it's with shareholders or government. With lenders, this may involve various changes to the terms and conditions of credit facilities, and it can come with a cost in various ways. Much of dealing with the here and now means dealing with adapting the workplace to government requirements and contractual arrangements with various parties. So formal restructuring or insolvency proceedings may be necessary to deal with some situations, but hopefully negotiated arrangements can be made in most cases. Dealing with all of this, again, requires agility, being forward-looking and proactive. One final note on this is that the impacts and fault lines of COVID are likely to increase the momentum for an increased focus on environmental, social, and government matters by business. And so that's something that should always be in the back of mind. In adapting to COVID, the old adage that you should never waste a good crisis comes to mind, and you've heard it used frequently. In dealing with all of this, a longer term view needs to be considered as well about how preservation and adaptation can lead to improvement. So what lessons are being learned and what opportunities are there for improvement, whether it's in technology, remote work, real estate costs, business travel, government intervention and assistance, or a number of other areas? Are there signs of new demand and business models that not only help with the short term, but which provide opportunities for the long term? And finally, as we move into M&A considerations, what sort of insights do those lessons learned and things that you've become aware of provide for M&A for your organization? Where does M&A fill a hole or present a transformative opportunity? You could perhaps go on to the next slide, please. So a gating item for focusing on M&A is really whether there'll be an opportunity or whether it's a distraction. Right now is a degree of focus required on your existing business such that M&A would be a distraction. And distraction is not only the acquisition process itself, but obviously the distraction of integrating new acquisitions, particularly if completed when existing businesses are already being triaged to be stabilized and adapted to the new situation, where you're dealing with things like protecting your existing employees, conserving your existing cash, and maintaining your existing supply chains. On the other hand, M&A can provide opportunities for adapting for your existing business, improving stability and growth prospects for a variety of reasons, whether technologies, supply chains, or customers. Can M&A, in short, help to optimize production, distribution, and logistics? This will vary considerably by industry and business. And industry sector expertise will be more critical than ever. But you can also look for innovation in looking at how acquisition targets in different areas might help a business. For instance, are there technologies that can assist you in a retail realm moving away from bricks and mortar? Are there things that can be done in terms of virtual applications that can replicate the in-store experience? There are strategic acquirers out there who are looking at and are acquiring these kinds of technologies to try to make that move. In the event a decision is made to proceed with M&A, the landscape has obviously changed significantly. So there's always uncertainty in M&A. We deal with it all the time, but COVID has multiplied that many times. There's now tremendous uncertainty around target businesses and the impact on operations and all of the areas we've talked about in terms of existing business. What has the impact been on employees, customers, suppliers, lenders, and others? And of course, a significant degree of uncertainty around valuation and an expectation gap that has grown quite likely between buyers and sellers with respect to valuations. So how do you address and protect against these risks and attempt to bridge this gap? Well, again, lots of tools have always been around in M&A to be able to address these, and we'll talk about more of those in a moment. You also have to think about the ability to finance. What impact has COVID had on the ability to finance acquisitions? That's perhaps more important for strategic acquirers. There's a significant amount of private equity dry powder, obviously, about $2.5 trillion globally by last count. But obviously where they want to try to deploy that, they want to try to leverage as well, and there may be questions around that in some instances. One other thing to think about in terms of M&A is forward investment. I think that we're going to see that, particularly with the issues that have occurred in terms of some supply chains, the geopolitical issues that are arising to some degree around COVID, and the attempt to bring back some economic growth in supply chains into domestic markets, given the degree of government intervention, is going to play out where we will likely see a less hospitable environment for forward investment going forward for some period of time on a political level. So again, as I mentioned, we're always dealing with uncertainty in M&A. This is obviously a heightened uncertainty time and a unique situation. But again, we have certain concepts and tools that we can try to deal with some of these issues. So if we're looking at this, what are some of the key issues that you might be facing? Well, due diligence is where we would start. We have new areas of inquiry, and we have a new environment in which we need to try to conduct diligence. More detailed due diligence is now required on certain areas to understand the impact of COVID on a target's operations. These include the very kind of things that you're looking at for your existing business. So supply chain dependency, resiliency, and business continuity planning. Matters related to employment and labor laws and the health, safety, and welfare of employees and compliance with laws. Key commercial contracts and risks related to termination and force majeure clauses and defaults in material agreements by either the target or counterparties to agreements with the target. What has been happening with the financing facilities of targets you may be looking at and compliance with their covenants with lenders. And of course, from a business perspective, a significant degree of new business diligence on financial projections and what the future of the business looks like going forward for several quarters in the COVID environment. And this is complicated, obviously, by the physical component of due diligence, really from the business and management side in terms of meeting with management and key employees, visiting operations, and similar activities. The disruption of physical diligence has perhaps made pre-existing relationships and industry sector expertise a competitive strength. So due diligence is an area where a significant amount of attention and adaptation is going to be required. Purchase price structures are going to be affected significantly. You know, purchase price consideration will have to be structured in many instances to try to preserve cash. Acquirers may be impacted by liquidity and ability to fund or finance deals. Obviously, purchasers who have cash and are able to finance will find favor. And you might also find that public companies with the ability to use shares as consideration may be favored as potential buyers as well. So the ability to finance an acquisition is a starting point for deal terms. But the purchase price can also be structured to deal with that financing uncertainty. And it can also has to be structured in order to deal with the valuation uncertainty and gap in expectations that will arise between buyers and sellers, which has been heightened because of the COVID situation. This can be addressed in part by deferred consideration, including vendor financing and contingent consideration based on performance earnouts. All these kinds of instances of deferred consideration and contingent consideration are also helpful in terms of providing security for buyers for potential set-offs against indemnity claims. Purchase price adjustments will also continue and take on a bigger role post-COVID, accounting for risk in declining working capital, increased reliance on debt or diminishing asset values. It's going to be difficult to understand what normalized working capital is going to be like in this situation, and buyers are going to want to protect against that, and sellers are going to want to see some sort of security. So you're probably going to see some sort of collars being requested on adjustments to permit fluctuations. Representations and warranties, similar to the due diligence realm, we're going to see a lot of unique reps and warranties, I think, that will require more thought and specificity tailored to the business of the target due to the impact of COVID on the business. What have been the effects and consequences of the pandemic on their financial conditions, results of operations, and prospects? What's been the effect of the pandemic on the workforce, supply chain, customers, inventory, accounts receivable, and material contracts? And have the targets been in compliance with laws that have arisen in connection with the pandemic? There's a whole host of new issues that need to be addressed. We'll also see pressure for stronger indemnification with more buyer-friendly provisions, I think, particularly in an environment where rep and warranty insurance may be less helpful, as we can probably expect greater exclusions related to pandemic-related matters and potential premium increases. I think we'll also see an increase in special indemnities for various matters related to impacts from COVID, and structuring of purchase price to provide security for indemnification will be a key concern. And again, that's where deferred consideration, contingent consideration, escrows, and holdbacks will start to come into play. In terms of financing, the availability of financing is going to include considering various needs. First of all, what is the secured liquidity of your existing business? For acquisitions, will new financing commitments be underwritten and on what terms? Will leverage be decreased from levels you previously would have expected for M&A? What due diligence will the lenders insist on, and how will that tie into your due diligence and affect timing? What sort of closing conditions will be required, and how might they align with the closing conditions that you would have in your acquisition, particularly around material adverse effect termination rights? In terms of timing, I think everything is obviously going to take longer. Due diligence, negotiations and deal terms, third-party and regulatory consents, and financing. So it's going to be a new world for M&A, but it's a world where we're adapting existing concepts to deal with these new issues. So we have a toolkit that's there to deal with it. And again, the key is basically to be agile and to adapt to these situations. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Vaughn. I appreciate that insight. And you know that the old adage of necessity is the motherhood of invention is certainly coming true for many of us. And I think we're going to have to learn to be a lot more agile than organizations have been in the past, and willing to make and able to make decisions much more quickly. When it comes to risk management, that's going to force those people involved in risk management in a big way to adapt the way that we've been looking at risk management in the past, and think about how we can keep up with the new pace that organizations are going to have. Final three thoughts on this, and summing it up, is you're going to have to plan better, move faster than you have before. That's not going to change. And even when the pandemic begins to significantly wane, and we get our organizations back to some sense of normalcy, there's still going to be that requirement to move much faster than we have before. Secondly, adapt your thinking about risk. Think of risk in terms of being agile, adaptive, and responsive, not in terms of controls and rigidity for organizations. And the third piece, disruption really is increased risk and opportunities. Those organizations that come out of this smarter and more agile will undoubtedly become a lot more successful than they have in the past. We're going to see consolidations in industries going on. As Vaughn mentioned, there's a lot of dry powder out there to do acquisitions. Strategic buyers are who come out of this stronger, are going to be looking for opportunities to pick up some of their weaker competitors as well. And so we're all going to be playing a much greater role when it relates to this. Now I'd like to ask a few questions, and I don't know who they came from, but one question for you, Rob, is how do I choose the right risk intelligence, workflow, and analytics tools for my organization? There are a bunch out there.
Yeah, it's a great question. And in the same way that we spend a lot of rigor and a lot of structure when we look for enterprise tools, the same goes for these tools as well. The first piece of advice I would give is they need to be scaled to the problem at hand. If you can manage with some version of Excel or some collaboration tool, that's fine. If your challenges, if your organization is more complex, if the risks are more pervasive, then the way you go about it is really with a needs assessment. You set your business requirements, and you go through what would normally be an acquisition program for a tool like this. There are some design points I would focus on, though. First is the need for integration. Your risk intelligence is going to have to tie into your workflow, is going to have to tie into your analytics engine, is going to have to tie into the visualization engine, and so on. So the ability to share, the ability to integrate is critical.
Great, thanks, Rob. One for you, Vaughn. What differences do you see between strategic players and private equity in thinking about the issues related to COVID?
Well, look, I think that it really is going to depend a lot by industry and by sector. But in terms of a generalization, I think that strategic acquirers would tend to be more on the sidelines, I think, while they're triaging their existing businesses. Private equity, just given the degree of the amount of powder that they have, I think have a lot more flexibility to be able to deploy, to look for new opportunities. They're going to be focused on existing investments as well and trying to figure out what they need to shore up and where they need to put some additional capital into existing investments, as opposed to maybe focusing on new deals. But I think that just generally, given the degree of or the amount of capital that's out there in the private equity realm, that they're going to be favored in terms of being acquirers. If you're a public company strategic acquirer, there may be some opportunities where you're able to use shares as consideration. And if you're a strategic acquirer otherwise that has cash and credit facilities available, then you're going to be in a good position as well. But I think that the damage just done to strategic acquirers across the board is probably something that tilts the landscape much more in favor of private equity, even more than it was before. The one thing I just would say about private equity is, I think it's interesting because they're going to have obviously traditional approaches to looking at M&A and targets and what they're trying to do in terms of their various investment strategies. But they're also seeing some new things that are coming about because of the crisis. And if you look at Brookfield as an example, Brookfield has started the retail fund where they're going to make investments in distressed retailers, and that obviously dovetails into into investments in real estate where there's some exposure there. So it has a component that is both new investment in companies, but also investment that's being made to try to shore up some of their other areas.
Yeah, fascinating environment. One for you, Rob. What is the transition to an agile risk model? Does it need to be done all at once?
No, it doesn't. I can't imagine how it could be without enough resources. And what we're going to find as we emerge from pandemic is that those resources are much needed in other parts of the organization. So I'm sensitive to that. What I would suggest is it can be planned. That transition can be planned out to focus on the most critical current or horizon risk. So if you see something coming down the path, and maybe it's like the example that we gave of the fabric example with toxicity, if those are ongoing issues, channel issues, and so on, then that's where you start. Maybe you test it with one implementation, which is around, let's say, supplier risk or third-party risk. Or customer risk, as we've talked about. In those cases, there are some pretty good tools out there already. There's some pretty good analytics out there already. Some of them are available in a SaaS model, which means they're really plug and play, not a lot of integration. And so what I would do is put a fence around what the objective is, and then look for solutions that are already out there and start to integrate those piece at a time.
Okay, and a follow-up question. This is from a mid-sized organization. We don't currently have a chief risk officer. Is this critical to having an agile risk management capability? Rob?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. The quick answer I would say is no. Let's get back to what the critical consideration is. The critical consideration is that in cases where your risks are really undefined, where they're pervasive, very much like the COVID situation, where you don't have the controls in place, you have the level of executive sponsorship that can drive agility, that can drive disruptive decision-making and management, And you may find that in other parts of the organization. It doesn't have to be a chief risk officer necessarily. As a CPA and CA, I've seen some chief financial officers that have those skills. And the other part of that equation is that, of course, they're holding the purse strings for investment in these technologies and these solutions. If you find a CFO that can do that, that's fine, as long as it's an executive level of sponsorship and the sponsor really understands the commitment to agility. The other way to attack it would be to say, look, we need a CRO. Maybe we get an interim executive or we get an executive coach. So we're dealing with this with part-time input. If you get the right person with a lot of experience, serving as a CRO really on an interim basis, you can go some pretty wonderful places.
Thank you. And a final question for each of you, and one for me if we get to it. What are the main opportunities you see coming out of this pandemic? Vaughn?
Oh, well, look, that's a difficult one. I think, there's some people who would sort of look at it and try to say, we, want to figure out about what's going to be the big societal change as a result of COVID. And you'll try to find people who say they're going to try to see what that is going to do and that they're going to find opportunities. So, big trends. So, right now, is remote working here to stay? Is the office dead? Is the final nail in the coffin for bricks and mortar retail? Obviously, making the right call on those kinds of long-term societal trends can be lucrative, but it can also be difficult. So, if you were to ask a historian, for instance, about any big changes that came about in business or in society because of the Spanish flu pandemic, I think they'd be pretty hard pressed to give you an answer. Now, it was a different day and age, of course, but I think we just need to be cautious about overreacting and trying to make those predictions about broad aspects of the future. I think really what you need to focus on is, your specific business, your specific industry, what is happening there in the short term in terms of dealing with the situation. In the longer term, if you're focusing on M&A or something you want to try to adapt internally, it's really, what are some of the trends within your business? Is remote work something that's going to be relevant to your business in the long term? What are the implications of that? Are there technologies out there that are going to fix and fill a gap for your business? And how do you access that? In terms of big, broad things coming out of COVID, I think, it's still too early to tell. And it's going to depend a lot on what happens, whether we have additional waves and how long we're dealing with this. But I think the one thing it does teach us is, reminds us that black swans exist to think about.
Thanks, Vaughn. Rob, anything to add to that?
Just a couple of things, and really it draws on what Vaughn just mentioned, which is there could be successive waves of these kinds of challenges. And I think what's most important are the lessons we've learned, which is we can suffer and recover, we can fail and learn from the failure. And I think one other thing that I think we've learned is that you can gain competitive advantage from agile management of your risk. So as you start to think about risk in real terms, fact-based terms, and you start to be very mobile, that creates the discipline and the competency within your organization to really achieve competitive advantage.
Thanks, Rob. And got one for me, actually. So how do you encourage your team to move faster in organizations? And it really comes down to having your organization be more synchronized, both the internal and external stakeholders. So communication is obviously key. Alignment, getting everybody to understand where you're going to, what done looks like, what the vision and the plans are in place, the paths there, in other words, the scenario plans, visibility, make sure that there's measurement there, make sure there's very clear accountability. We're doing a lot of work within our organization, with other organizations right now around clarifying accountability, roles and responsibilities, making that crisp and disciplined. And the last point, of course, is discipline. And as I said many times before, discipline is not about being rigid. Think of a great, successful sports team. They are very disciplined, but they are not rigid. If they were rigid, they'd be predictable. But they're disciplined so they can adapt and be agile to the situations that they're facing. And those are really the critical elements to teams moving faster, and building trust, of course, within the organization. That helps a lot. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Really appreciate you all doing that. If you have any questions whatsoever, we're glad to answer them. Maggie's email address is up there. You can contact us directly. Thanks very much, everyone, for your time. Vaughn, thank you very much for your contributions, and Rob, you as well. Great day. Thanks.
Thank you.